Hey y'all. Before we get started, I just have a quick reminder. If you enjoy what I do, make sure to give a like and comment, and don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. One click for you makes a world of difference for me. Alright, now back to your regularly scheduled program. Enjoy. The Strange and Unwanted Effects of Lucas Griffiths' Inheritance. An original short story by Charlie C.C. Thomas. Lucas Griffiths stood amid the grand foyer of his late uncle's estate, much as he had when he first arrived. But that was the only similarity. Some months ago, Lucas, having received urgent news of his uncle's passing and orders to travel to his estate in Westmoreland, sailed from Massachusetts to England, meeting his uncle's aged friend and executor, William Borrow. The night he arrived, he'd climbed the stone steps to the littered dais, crossed the threshold, and clacked into the dusty, cobweb-riddled foyer. It had been dark enough outside that night, but inside hardly seemed better. Some candles and a few gas lamps burning just enough to keep from tripping. He'd wondered if there was any fortune left in the will, given the state of things, but after 3 hours of Mr. Borrow listing item after property, after business, after corporate share, there proved to be quite a fortune after all, and all left to him. So, he decided to stay. After all, there was nothing left in Massachusetts for him. Perhaps England would prove a fresh start for a man of 31. He'd hired locals from the surrounding towns to help him clean the estate, something they all seemed glad to do, for riddance and pay alike. And soon after, he'd hired staff to help tend the cattle afield, the grounds, and the house itself whilst he went through his uncle's effects. Not 3 weeks upon arrival, the house and grounds were under way to what could have been their former glory had his uncle tended to them. And not 3 weeks upon arrival was there word of problem after problem, cracked stone, broken brick, rotten wood, and all else. So Lucas called for architects, masons, and carpenters, and hired local townsmen to help him rebuild. Then, not a week into restoring the holes and threats to the infrastructure, Lucas stood amid the grand foyer, hands on his underfed hips, a smile on his pale face, and glittering black eyes following the bustle of workmen. They busied themselves with this and that, removing old stone to be replaced, mending and varnishing the stairway, carving new busts to be nailed into the walls. Later, they would even pull down the crystal chandelier to replace what was missing. Chatter filled Lucas's ears and made his heart leap as he reached for his silver cross. Everything was assembling nicely. Soon, he thought, I'll have a proper home and a proper business. Soon these men might think of me respectfully, instead of the rich stranger. Soon I might find myself a good wife and rebuild the Griffiths clan here, where we started. He kissed his cross. 1 month later, Lucas trekked down the spiral stone steps to the cellar carved into the stone of the hill the house sat atop. He held a lamp in one hand, with the final load of supplies on the opposite shoulder he'd need to mend the cracked wall in the back of the cellar. He'd worked at it for days, but the slurry was never right. He wasn't a laborer, but if the men kept leaving, he'd have to be. As he walked the shelves of canned, dried, pickled, and aging foodstuffs, the only sound was the clack of his now worn shoes and the creaking lamp casting strange shadows. His eyes adjusted quickly to the dark, ears ringing in the silence, without even the whisper of another soul. The once deafening ruckus of construction and repair, of saws, hammers, and shouts was gone with the men who took them, blanketing the manor in silence. And he would admit the silence was eerie, like there might be a whisper come from the shadows any moment. But he never saw what the men claimed to see. Shadows of men not there, or men without shadows. Beating wings inside without birds. The unseasonal cold. Perhaps they could be chalked up to working in a run-down place, but the stories the men told of a cloud of crows landing on the manor, or hordes of pests crawling from the bowels of the house to run afield, leaving their young and burrows behind. He never saw those. But there were plenty of accidents, he'd admit. And it was odd that pests never touched the food, never seemed to touch the cellar. though there were many. The men called it the work of evil spirits. Others said fae, some said the dead were to blame, but all the townsfolk left the same, no matter what they believed. Even the masons and carpenters from abroad hardly came anymore, though they promised to stay on. More like to find their letters of resignation than them at the door soon, he thought. But maybe I can keep them on if their work's outside. He sighed and clenched his jaw as he came into the central aisle and followed it in silence, mind working through every task yet to do. His eyes flitted over and swept the tiled floor, vibrant blue, green, and white, lost in the windowless gloom like the red of the brick columns. Then, reaching the rear of the cellar, he followed the hinder wall until he found the decorative brick arch around the crack, the only one in the cellar. He'd expected to find more of the slurry dried and crumbled away as it had before, but instead, he stopped and stared, slack-jawed, at the gaping black pit above a heap of rubble. He set the sack of supplies against one of the nearby shelves and crept around the rubble. Slabs of stone lay haphazardly below the brick arch and across the floor, pieces of wall skittered and flung away where they'd fallen and shattered. But there should have just been more rock behind the wall. Even if pieces of the face had broken away, there shouldn't have been an empty space behind. Lucas kept his lamp under him as he tried his footing and crept toward the mouth of the arch, a hand finding the brick as he squinted into the cavity. There was no dust in the air, letting the light catch a smooth floor beyond and something like walls or doorways either side that disappeared into the gloom. He stepped forward, leaning under the arch to straighten on the other side, holding the lamp above his head to keep the light from his eyes as he spun. He covered his mouth and nose against the stale air, coughing as he stepped toward one of the walls. Everything was smoothly carved slabs of stone from floor to ceiling, as the space stretched into a long walkway with columns, not doorways, supporting the ceiling along the walls. Lucas swallowed and shivered. The air at his back, though cool, was warmer than in the tunnel. It seeped through his work-sullen shirt and trousers, sprouting goosebumps. The air, though still, seemed to stir like something swam in it, sending the hairs on his nape on end. He took a step back, then clenched his jaw, pressing forward into the black, eyes flicking everywhere for holes, doors, and any other surprises. He walked a ways along the hall until he found doors, wooden and shut with black iron latches and handles. Inside the first few there was nothing, just more stale air in the small cells. Were you for sleeping? He thought. Or storage, maybe? Is this a family tomb? He stepped amid the walkway and spun around, light still above his head and shoulder burning as he studied the columns, the walls, doors, floor, but there were no marks. Everything was smooth, save a few cracks and broken patches of stone from accident and age. He looked over his shoulder for the way he'd come, the outline of the arch only just visible in the gloom of the cellar, and his hairs stood straight. Every inch of him crawled and bristled like something were crouching in the black further into the hall, like the air swam with its breath, promising words. He slowly turned and faced it, eyes wide and unblinking as they delved into the dark, and found nothing. Still, his skin crawled in waves like something watched him only a foot away. He stepped back with a hand on his cross necklace, telling himself that he needed to leave because the space could be unsafe, nearing the cellar and still facing the depths of the earth. He grinned at himself, took a deep breath, and fought his instincts to turn around and walk back the way that he'd come. Then, something stirred the air on his sweaty neck, and whether it was imagination, draft, or beast, Lucas bolted like a boy after his mother's skirts. His feet pounded on the smooth stone, then leapt around the ruined wall, bending in half to jump through the arch and spin. He skittered on his heels, falling into the side of a shelf with the lamp raised, panting, eyes wide, heart racing, as he took up the hammer from his belt without thinking. He stared into the yawning wall for a while before he dared step sideways and move away, sprinting back up the steps for the light of midday streaming through the kitchens. The light's warmth bathed his skin as he rolled up his sleeves and leaned on the countertop, panting, hammer set aside as he shut his eyes. What was that? He asked himself, unable to shake the feel of the black. There's nothing in the plans. I've seen them 100 times now, but it's almost familiar. Maybe there's something in Uncle's journals. He laughed at himself for even considering looking at those pagan things again. He stood straight, drug his hands down his face, and went to leave for the study. Then someone spoke, and he jumped out of his skin before he laughed, hand at his chest, and spun. "Chester! Sir, you gave me a fright." The man, Chester, was the best carpenter he had, hired from a village south of London where he preferred to stay than the city. He smiled wide, though it didn't meet his sapphire eyes, wrinkled, though he were no older than Lucas. "Sorry, sir. I just wanted to tell you I was here." "Very good," Lucas said, crossing the room and taking the man's hand in a firm shake. "Thank you for staying on." Chester nodded, his face skinnier than when he'd started and skin a deal paler. His eyes were darker too, like he hadn't eaten or slept. They darted around the kitchen for a moment before he went to motion behind him, mouth open to pardon himself. Lucas stopped him. "Are you all right? You look like you've seen better days." Chester chuckled uncomfortably. "If I'm honest, sir, I have done. Sleep isn't easy for me to find lately, and when I do, it seems the only dreams for me are dark, cold, hungry." His face went grave for a moment before he snapped back to life like he'd remembered where he was. "But I'm fine, sir. Tired's all." "Are you eating well?" Lucas grinned at himself, dropping the other's hand. "I don't mean to sound like your mother, but you should eat more, man." Chester smiled. "I do that, sir, though not for lack of trying. I eat and can't seem to keep my weight. It's like I have worms." They both chuckled, and Lucas motioned into the kitchen. "Well, if you're hungry, eat. There's more than enough for me and a whole staff, Chester. Take what you want." Chester blinked. "Are you certain?" Lucas nodded with a comforting smile. "Of course. I know this place has been troubling. I don't want you any more troubled than you have been. Have a bite if you're hungry, man. But I must go to the study. I need to check something." He left with a pat to Chester's shoulder, but turned as he reached the swiveling kitchen door. "But don't go into the cellar. There's something needs fixing down there." Chester looked at the cellar door, shoulders rolling like he'd had a chill, and nodded. "No worries, sir. What business has a carpenter down in the stone and brick?" Lucas nodded with a small smile and left, taking the hall to a lesser stair for the 3rd floor and winding the halls to the east wing, opening the double doors of his uncle's study over the foyer. It was large, big as the foyer itself, and doubled as a library. The walls were covered from floor to raised ceiling with dark wooden shelves that were crammed full of books. Others sat on small tables, scattered about beside reading chairs or on one of the 3 desks down the center aisle. He passed them all, feet quiet on the huge ornate rugs, and grabbed the ladder out of habit, pushing it ahead of him on its tracks in case he needed to climb for one of his uncle's earlier journals. The lamp in hand, he stopped at the final desk and rifled through the diaries left there. Each one represented either 1 year or a quarter of one, with the dates embedded in the hard leather binding on the face and spine. He flipped through the pages, lamp set aside and turned out as the sun streamed through the windows, now at Lucas's back. He ignored the occultic sigils and symbols scrawled with his uncle's clear hand around it, detailing his own larger version of the Lesser Key of Solomon. There were depictions of creatures that he claimed to have seen or found. Illustrations of visions taken under drink, drug, or dream came to life in pencil and ink with accounts of the events beside and on the following pages. In some places, schematics were scrawled in haste and refined later with pen, his notes jotted around them with names and descriptions, half of it in languages Lucas recognized and half that he didn't. The Latin he could make out when it cropped up, a bit of the French and Italian too, but the rest was something else. He shut the final journal and took to the ladder, climbing halfway and pulling down another. There was something about a complex, he whispered, leaning into the ladder to free his hands as he flipped through the pages and returned the journal to its shelf. Or a dream of one that he wanted to build. Maybe it was something he read on the local pagans? He sighed, annoyed and impatient as he flipped through book after book. He jumped years, a whole decade once, until he found what he was sure was the right one. He opened the book and flipped past the dreams of demons and shadows, past drug-induced hallucinations and stories of wandering naked afield to commune with beasts. He ignored the drawings of his uncle's face done in a drunken stupor, the proportions close enough but wrong in a way that made his guts churn. Then he found it. A diagram. He marked the page with his finger and descended the ladder to sit at his desk, putting his back to the window to read by sunlight. His fingers traced the paper, eyes running through the English notes and Latin amongst the strange other tongues. The schematic was simple. Along a hall hemmed in columns, then small rooms from the middle, to a grand entrance leading into an antechamber, and beyond, a half circle with halls leading to 2 large rooms in the back corners. Entrance is protected, he read aloud from a note at the bottom, near the beginning of the hall. Then he moved to another. Storerooms for non-living things only. Sacrifices are brought in as needed. Excellent, Uncle, thank you. He moved up to a Latin note, pointing to the rooms nearest the antechamber, translating as he read. Priestly garments and sacraments are kept here. There were no notes on the antechamber, but dozens littered the top of the page for the main chamber and the rooms beyond. Most of them were in other tongues, but a few were in Italian and Latin. The door will stay open, one said, until the rock is broken. He moved to one of the rooms. Altar is here. Sacrifice here. Then to the other. Home is here. Lucas furrowed his brow and found the final legible note pointing to the middle of the back wall of the main chamber. Pencil outlining something not drawn in ink. Cannot return, or I will go with him. Cannot return. Do not return. Break the stone. The next day. Lucas stood before the yawning mouth in the cellar, cleared of debris and dust, best as could be done by himself, showing the floor level between cellar and hall. He'd set 3 mirrored lamps inside, lighting the darkness with full canisters of oil. Another mirrored lamp blazed in one hand, the journal in the other, with a sheathed knife hanging from his belt. He took a deep breath, thankful the night had abated the staleness, and said a quick prayer. He carefully examined the walls and columns as he went, but they were as blank and smooth as before. There were no footprints in the dust save his own, no handprints on the walls, none even by him. Then he came upon the doors. He opened the journal to the right page and double-checked the diagram, the doors marked the halfway point, before going through each one. But the cells were still all windowless and empty. The wood of the doors, like the surrounding stone, was smooth and untouched, yet the foreboding weight of the darkness was gone, or had moved elsewhere. There were no invisible eyes, nor the bristle of hair screaming for him to flee, nor the imaginations of breath on his shoulder. The hall was just an empty stretch of stone in the hill's dirt. But, scouring the floor, he found the end of his old tracks in the dust. Then he swallowed and looked forward into the bottomless black, like looking into the hungry depths of the ocean. He took his cross, grip tightening on the lamp as he filled his own footprints and held the light above his face. There were more doors lining the walls, more columns between them, and more hallway dissolving into darkness. He shivered, fingers aching in the sudden cold. His hairs stood up as he took another step, and the grind of sole on floor might as well have been clattering steel in the silent air, thick as water. He tried to quiet his breathing, goosebumps coming in waves as his gut twisted, trying to pull him away through his spine, with each step deeper into the earth. But at the same time, he flicked his eyes side to side, remembering the rooms and checking for markings. Each time he looked into a cell, he did it quickly, whirling quick as lightning before checking for something at his back. And each time, there was nothing but empty air. He stood between two doors, back to the wall as he checked the journal and counted the cells. It wasn't accurate. He rolled his eyes and shut the journal. Then I might not be in the middle of this after all, he thought. If it isn't to scale, I could spend days yet trying to find the other side, if there is one. He looked away from the distant lights of the mirrored lamps by the cellar and set his mouth, furrowing his brow as his eyes drifted down the floor. Even if the hall goes on for a while, he thought, the hill's only so big. There'll be an end eventually. Unless it starts climbing down, a rogue thought answered, but he ignored it and flicked back to the darkness, taking up his lamp and pressing on cell to cell until the end of the hall and a wide archway. It was hemmed in raised stone, cut like a braided knot all around with serpents' heads and tails unraveling on the floor either side. Above, tiny figures seemed to dance together, though their sex was ambiguous as the stone, and above it all, a half-circle was carved into the ceiling in a series of wedges that could have been writing. He lifted the lamp in front and crept toward the arch, swiveling around the room beyond and finding 3 doors left and right. Each bears the rest save their frames decorated like the arch with birds lighting all around them. He swept the light over the floor and ceiling and furrowed his brows at the twin image of the sun with outstretching arms and hands in its light. A beautiful face carved in the center that could have been a man or a woman. Then he brought the light forward, and his lips parted around tense jaws at the flat stone wall, covered in hundreds of scenes and circles of wedge-shaped glyphs. He scanned them, trying to commit them to memory as best he could to investigate the journals and books of pagan rituals later, but there were too many to recount. Men and women danced naked in the wilderness and the fields, around fires and beasts and strange giants. They took to finery. Beneath each face of the moon they lay together shamelessly. They warred together with swords and horse and fire. Then in the bottom, great waves swept over the land, and the scene beneath showed a box atop a mountain, and beautiful men watching from the sky and the ground, and beneath the earth. The last image showed a man on a boulder, limbs fastened in place like Prometheus without his eagle. Lucas squinted and stepped forward, then shivered as the air went frigid. He stepped back with a whispered prayer swallowing on a dry throat and looked all around. He quickly checked the rooms. Rotten clothes hung on the walls with tables and instruments set around. Then he rushed back down the hall. He lashed his arms around himself, running the last few yards to clear into the study for a thick stack of thin paper and a box of charcoal. Then he sprinted back, past the doors and through the archway. He set the first sheet to the highest corner of the writing that he could manage to reach, and gasped at the icy touch of the stone. He pulled away and tested it again before setting back to work, quickly scouring the charcoal sticks over the pages until glyphs came through, then again until all the glyphs were there, and each page was numbered. He stacked the pages, took up his lamp, and bolted back through the frigid darkness. Goosebumps rolled over him even as he broke into the cellar. His guts churned and heart raced like he'd just fought for his life, like a predator still watched him from the shadows. He panted, leaning against the side of a shelf and staring into the darkness, regretting that he'd have to go back to retrieve the lamps and wondering if it was worth just letting them burn out. He grinned and chuckled despite himself. No wonder everyone's left. 2 weeks later. Lucas had tried translating the stencils himself, even managed to pen down an accurate enough copy of each line with notes on their positions relative to one another, but the library held no clues to their translation. So, he tried advertising for a translator across Britain and America, or a historian, or archaeologist for that matter, who might have a clue what the stencils could mean. However, despite further scouring of the library, all he managed to find was something called cuneiform, used by extinct empires in the Middle East. And when he checked for correspondences, there were only jokes from students and conmen, from whom he was saved by Mr. Borrow's eye. He seemed to know of them and told Lucas in the study, with a stiff drink too early in the morning, that he would gladly advertise in the appropriate circles. "Would you, Mr. Borrow?" Lucas had asked from the rear desk of the study, still in yesterday evening's clothes from sleeping there. The old man nodded, head gray and face slender as the rest of him. His suit hugged his scrawny frame close and sheened in the low lamplight like it were wet. "I have many friends across the civilized world, my boy, and I would be very happy to see this mystery of yours solved." He raised the glass of brandy slightly and smiled. "If not for your sake alone, then for the friendship I had with old Geoffrey. It was a strange one, your uncle, always delving into shadows that he shouldn't." He sipped the drink and set it on the table, asking for writing paper. "But I'll help you see this done. There shall be a flurry of letters leave this house like the birds from the window of the ark." And his help had been just that, with word coming back from several who were interested in the story and stones spoken of in the letter, but upon detailed exchanges, several reluctantly reported to be unable to help or know of anyone who might. Then Mr. Borrow took to bed with sudden illness, staying in one of the guest rooms at Lucas's insistence, and the correspondences came back empty-handed, save one letter from an old friend of Mr. Borrow and Lucas's uncle alike. He'd said that he couldn't help but knew someone who could, and said he'd already written him with the letter previously disclosed, so he might come to speed. A Frenchman named Yves Abadie. The next day, Mr. Yves wrote Lucas and said that he could help, requesting copies of the glyphs to translate, so Lucas sent him photographs of the stencils. Lucas received a letter not 2 days later, marked as having been sent the day before and costing Mr. Yves a fortune, no doubt, wherein the Frenchman said that he would arrive to translate the wall in person. So, as Lucas arranged for nurses to tend to Mr. Borrow in the day and took his care in the night, he waited for the young philologist to arrive, and met him at the door when he did. Yves Abadie was a young man, younger than Lucas, with skin that hadn't seen the sun in too long, short brown hair, and black eyes that looked out through wire glasses. He could have been any other man, or even a boy, but the finery of his clothes wasn't what Lucas had expected from a young philologist and archaeologist, though his accent was as strong as Lucas had hoped against. "Mr. Griffiths, I am Monsieur Yves Abadie, the one to whom you have spoken," he said, hand out and shaking firmly beneath the morning sun. "Hello. Thank you for coming. Mr. Borrow's upstairs, if you'd like to see him before we get started." He raised his eyebrows, then grinned. "Pardon, mais I had forgotten you were American. But no, I do not know Monsieur Barrow, and this is a most intriguing matter. Show me the rest of these, the drawings. No, the pictures? Stencils?" "The stencils, yes, thank you. Show me the stencils. I like to begin immediately." Lucas grinned despite himself and nodded, motioning into the manor and taking some of the luggage in hand, telling Mr. Yves to leave them by the top of the stairs, and he would take them to his room later. "You have no stuff?" Mr. Yves asked, as they walked through the manor and around the half-complete construction. "And no laborers to finish their work, is what you say?" "Yes and no. I have no staff. No workmen either. They all left some months ago, and pardon the darkness, I can't light too many lamps at once, with so few people to keep watch on the flames." "Why have they abandoned you?" Mr. Yves asked as they rounded a corner and began to climb the last flight of stairs. for the same reason I lock myself in with Mr. Barrow and pray without end in the night," he thought, but said aloud, "I'm not exactly sure. There was talk of weird goings-on, but I've seen nothing like they spoke of. Only the eyes in the shadows," he thought, and the voice on the air that isn't there. "Shameful. A man should work when he promises. And always when there is dollars. Money. And yes, I think you're right. But I can't force them to stay. And they're my neighbors. I'd rather keep myself in their good graces." Then they came upon the study's slender double doors and walked its length as Mr. Eve voiced his understanding and quickly steered Lucas to recall everything. The stencils were brought out, the photographs and Lucas's copy of the glyphs, and an hour later, Mr. Eve told him it was a form of ancient Babylonian and demanded to see where they came from. So Lucas readied several mirrored lamps and lined the entrance to the hall in the cellar, taking Mr. Eve into the earth and setting more lamps by the columns as they went until all 7 lit the hall. Then they found the serpent archway. Mr. Eve took the hand lantern from Lucas, lighting the ornate wall, his slack face stretching to a grin. Then he furrowed in confusion. "What is it? Is there something that I missed that changed the translation?" Lucas asked from the other man's side. "No, your work was well. This is amazing. I can see the writing more clearly, yes, but it says the same." Mr. Eve stepped forward, brows still furrowed, as he grazed his fingers over the wall, then rubbed them on his trousers against the cold. "But it is strange, no? The labor of the art, it is not Babylonian. None of these scenes are from their mythology, I think. I don't recognize any person here." He pursed his lips and looked down, kneeling and scanning the lower hem of the wall. Then he pushed Lucas back and followed it, looking up the right side, then the ceiling and down the left. Words, new words. An inscription I missed? Yes, thank you, an inscription. He stepped closer, squinting and taking off his glasses to nearly touch the wall with his nose. It says, again, repeats, the same words, like an enchantment or a prayer. No, an instruction? No, for bad things, to say not to enter? He faced Lucas, hands moving to prod him for a word. Lucas blinked and grinned at the ridiculousness of it all and then said, "A warning?" "Yes," Mr. Eve said with a pointed finger before he returned to the words, whispering French under his breath. "It speaks of a door and a rock. The rock must break for the door to shut." Lucas's skin bristled in goosebumps as the air seemed to get even colder. My uncle wrote something similar in one of his journals. "Is there something about a man on the rock also?" Mr. Eve continued like he hadn't heard. "And here, something about blood. Always blood with these people." "What people?" "Ancient barbarians always wanted blood for something. Our blood is wine for the gods." Mr. Eve raised his eyebrows and wiggled his fingers before he laughed at himself and returned to the text. "Here also, it speaks of blood and breaking the stone for the door to close. Maybe this is a door, not a wall." "But it's already shut, isn't it?" "Perhaps. There is another door? What did your uncle say about it?" "He didn't say anything about the wall. It's not in his notes. He talks about a door in a chamber behind here, I think, but there's no door on the diagram for here. Maybe he made a mistake and didn't fix it." "I don't know, but whatever this is will be the find of a century. This has no business being here, and certainly wasn't made by your uncle, surely. There's too much work." Mr. Eve motioned back the way they'd come, with a hand rising to rest on the wall. "Shall we see what is on the other face?" Lucas was silent a moment, then set his jaw. He'd come this far, and if the discovery brought money, the better to pay his workers with, and put the locals' minds at ease. Lucas nodded. So they left the hall for tools and returned with full arms, iron bars and pickaxes, chisels, hammers, mallets, and anything else they thought they could need. But 5 hours of work saw little progress. They'd broken past the skin on the right side of the door, trying to keep as many of the murals intact as possible, but had only beaten a few inches down. It would take days to work, maybe weeks, to chisel and axe their way through the stone, even with a dozen other stronger men. They broke for a few moments to eat and collect themselves, sitting and sweating in the cold from their work as Lucas cut an apple. He stared at the wall, wondering what in the world was behind it, when the air seemed to stir. He whipped around to what he thought was the noise, and the blade sliced down his palm with a hiss as he bolted onto his feet and brought the bleeding wound to the lamp. He flexed his hand and examined it, wincing but refusing to go back to clean it. He just poured water over it and wrapped it with a thin rag before he set back to work. After another hour, and the 7th time that he'd aggravated his wound, he gave Mr. Eve his pickaxe, setting his naked cut to the stone and wincing at the burning cold before his shoulders relaxed and the chill seeped into his flesh. The angry throb lessened as he sighed, though blood still flowed from his hammering the wall earlier. He winced and pulled his hand away, picking out a speck of stone wedged into the cut as trickles of dark blood fell over some of the glyphs and the murals until droplets finally traced the rings around the wall and puddled to the floor. The room trembled, and the men found each other's eyes, backing away from the wall and dropping their tools as they readied to bolt. The wall shook, clattering the doors on their hinges and sending a few to the ground before it dropped under its own weight in a cloud of dust. The men yelled and threw themselves back, stumbling into the hall like newborn calves as dust exploded over them. Then it all sucked backward as they pushed up and staggered back to the archway. The antechamber was clear of dust, surprisingly. Only 2 of the wooden doors lay askew in the lamplight. The carved wall wasn't face down on the floor, but had sunken vertically into it, with its top flush. Where it had been, a room unfolded with something massive in the middle, directly in front. Lucas stepped forward, face slack and heart steady as he scooped up the lamp and stepped through the new entryway, breath steaming as goosebumps broke on his skin. He spun around once inside the main chamber, remembering from the journal that it was supposed to be a half-circle, and found that accurate, at least, the flat side opposite the entrance. The doors were in the corners too, though they were massive, standing floor to vaulted ceiling. Everything was made of the hill's stone, but every surface was carved with scenes, like Egyptian or Mayan murals in the style that the wall had been earlier. The floor, walls, half-dome ceiling, everything showed battle on earth and sky alike, giants among men, kings with women at their sides, then rushing waves toppling their cities and swallowing the whole world. Blocks of text were dispersed between the scenes, with more lining the seams of ceiling, wall, and floor. And in the center, a statue stood halfway to the ceiling of a man lashed to a boulder, his feet shackled just above the floor as his hands were opposite. If the statue could have stood, it would have been monstrously tall, body defined as the Greek gods, pale as marble and just as nude. Only the statue's face and upper half were obscured as Lucas walked deeper in, shoes thudding in the frigid, silent air. Then Mr. Eve came around, keeping pace with Lucas until he saw the rings of glyphs encircling the statue. He motioned Lucas forward and to shine the light down, both silent as grave robbers, as Mr. Eve translated in his head. The glyphs were large, each the size of Lucas's palm and carved like the rest before them. As they rounded the statue's right hand, Lucas furrowed his brow at a slight whistle, cocking his head and turning over his shoulder to stare at the wall before the statue's face. Empty blackness ate the air, pulsating like it had substance, like the light refused to enter, as wind and snow drifted through the massive, yawning maw. Frost littered the floor and crawled up the walls around it, but not out of it. There were no solid edges to that thing. In fact, the murals and glyphs continued right into the opening as though it had been a solid thing once, and the hole had been knocked through. But there was no debris or rubble. In the distance of the dark maw, tiny lights flickered like embers before they were extinguished, roaring to life for an instant before snuffing themselves out as tiny explosions dotted a distant, undulating landscape. Mr. Eve broke the silence, scolding Lucas in French until he found it too, and stopped, and stared, hands rising to remove the glasses that weren't there. Chains rattled, and the men jumped a foot back, feet sliding on the stone as they clutched for one another, eyes wide and fixed on the statue. Lucas's throat went dry, stomach dropping as the statue moved, pulling against the black chains on his wrists and ankles, the one running over his stomach and throat. Then it turned its gaze on them, eyes once dark, now glittering with their own light, hazel as gold and lighting the pale, perfect face. His hair was long, tumbling over itself in a braid that ended in tight curls. The blood has returned. His voice was no different than a man's, but it carried like thunder in the chamber. And it brings a witness. Come, Griffiths. Fulfill the oath demanded of you by your ancestors and break the stone. The giant beat his fist into the dark stone that he was wrapped around, his mouth tight, full lips pursed and high cheeks reddening with color, as if his heart had just begun to beat. What's your name? Lucas asked in a small voice. The giant smiled, a beautiful thing, as he relaxed over the rock, languid like he were stretched on a sofa. I've been given many names, son of Griffiths. What should you call me shall do for now. What are you? What think you me? The giant asked with a chuckle, rumbling in his throat. You're a giant? Lucas swallowed, remembering the giant spoken of in the scriptures. I am that, the giant said, motioning him forward. Come. You already bleed. Set your hand to the stone and break it. Then the door shall be shut, and I might stand once more. Mr. Eve stepped forward, hand on Lucas's chest, babbling in French before he switched to English. Lord of the wilderness, he shouted, breath coming sharp. He pulled at Lucas's arm. We must go. He's the scapegoat, the dirty thing, the tempter of man. I offer nothing that you wouldn't already desire, the giant cooed, but Mr. Eve didn't listen. This is a coffin, a prison for that evil spirit. He rounded on the giant, finger pointing as he slung the words like a curse. Evil, the giant mused. I saw what was beautiful and taught your simple ancestors what it was to put color on your cheeks. Is that really worth a punishment like this? Ferme ta bouche au nom de Jésus-Christ, Mr. Eve shouted, a rosary clinking in his hand. Then the giant's eyes flared wide with cold fire, his lovely face twisting into a beautiful scowl that deepened his blush until he was purple all over. Then he thrashed against the chains, lurching toward the men, and a shadow cast off him like a cloak, sailing through the air and taking a twisted shape. It reached out for Mr. Eve and pushed him back with such force that his ribs cracked before he flew to the other side of the room and smashed into the wall. I will not have that name spoken here, the giant boomed and writhed, his voice mounting with the wind from the yawning darkness until it became a howling scream. Lucas, wide-eyed and frozen, blinked and suddenly found the world rushing by as his legs carried him from chamber to antechamber to hall, his breath coming out in a whispered prayer as his heart pounded in his ears. Lord, protect me. Send your warring angels round about me. Set your hedge of protection around me. Lord, protect me. Send your warring angels round about me. Set your hedge of protection around me. And on he chanted the same words, gasping as he crashed through the hall and slammed into the side of a shelf in the cellar. He groaned, leaning on it and catching his breath. Then he looked at his bleeding hand and screamed when the howl echoed down the hall, sending cold breath out of the archway. 3 days later, Lucas stood at the mouth of the antechamber, lamp in hand and thick woolen clothes pulled around him as he took a breath to steel himself, squeezing his cut palm into a fist. The ache was enough to make his nose wrinkle and tell him that he was really there. No going back. He lifted the lamp and crossed the threshold through the antechamber to the next. He swallowed as the whispering wind came from the hidden maw behind the bound giant. He shut his eyes, squeezing his hand hard. This thing has made my family's home a ruin. It's endangered the men around me, killed Mr. Eve, and has been shackled to this rock. It cannot be released. Lucas Matthew Griffiths. The giant's voice came as before, like any man's, but sweet as honey. Have you come to fulfill your birthright? Lift your hand and let drink the stone from your veins, and you shall stand among me as my sons once did to rule men and flesh and all the earth. We shall subdue it again. Lucas opened his eyes with a deep, painful breath through his nostrils, hands squeezed so hard his nails would have dug into the cut, if not for the gloves. Give yourself to me. The giant moved on the stone strangely, as if to invite him, but in no way that Lucas wanted. Living God of Israel, hear my prayer. Silence your tongue! The giant writhed, lurching up as shadows quivered under its skin, fighting to free themselves. You will never leave me, nor forsake me. Even now, I know you're here. He isn't here, you fool. He's dead. He bound me here because I dared pursue my own will and not his. I am your servant, washed in the blood of the perfect lamb. You're washed in swine piss. The shades bulged under his skin, several clawing free and clambering over him like overlapping reels of film, each reaching for Lucas. Your spirit is upon me, my seal of salvation. None shall remove me from your hand. He shut his eyes and straightened as he stepped forward with a sure foot. You order the steps of the righteous man, so order mine. Take my hands as your instruments. Use me for your will. He is dead! He is risen. The giant laughed, and Lucas opened his eyes, the cold eating through his clothes and numbing his skin as the wind howled from the black maw. He looked up at the shadows, and his heart twisted, each a broken, writhing silhouette with hollow eyes. He bolted down to the stone. No. Keep my eyes from the waves. You are my strength when I am weak, my fortress, my strong tower. You are the one who goes before me to conquer my enemies. What has he conquered? I am here, the giant chuckled, his voice sweet once more as the shadows quivered and pulled back, arms shielding their faces as they hissed soundlessly. Your ancestors walked through the mouth of hell and found me. They built this hill as my altar. I am woven into your blood and seed as I was theirs. That which the enemy means for evil, the Lord means for good for all those who love him. You love the Lord, the giant laughed. You who defile yourself with your hands and your eyes, you who become drunk and curse and doubt, what faith have you to move this mountain, boy? I am the ruler of flesh, the instructor of iron and war. I am he who made women beautiful in your eyes and gave you the art of the faces of the moon and herbs. I am the prince of flesh and secret things, and your God has yet to cast me asunder. The Lord rebuke you, Satan, for your day of judgment shall come. The shadows screamed and writhed without sound, clawing to break free of the rest of the giant and skitter away. The gates of hell shall not prevail against me, for the Christ is in me, and he is greater than he who is in the world. Lucas smiled and laughed, setting down the lamp and noticing the little black wheels beneath the rock, hidden by the shadows and chains before. What faith have I? A mustard seed. But that can move mountains. He pushed and gritted his teeth, and the stone didn't move. The giant laughed. You see? You are damned from your God, boy. I am your only salvation now. Come to my side and suckle the wisdom from my bosom, and I shall save you. Release me, and I shall deliver all flesh unto you. What good is it? to gain all the power and riches of this world if I lose my soul? Lucas strained. For I will not surrender it to you. I am a child of the Most High God. There is a place for me in his house. My name is written in the Lamb's Book of Life, and one day I shall stand with all the saints and judge you, Azazel.
Release me.
The giant screamed in an inhuman voice, shaking the room. You are not welcome here, foul spirit! Lucas screamed against the stone. Out! Begone of this house in the name of Jesus Christ! The stone jerked forward, and Lucas stumbled, catching himself on the boulder before he righted, laughed, and pushed. Out, Azazel, slave of the Prince of the Air! The stone jolted forward and Lucas pressed on. You damned spirit! The stone moved again. I will proclaim his name forever and lift up his praises. Oh, great God of heaven and earth, great is your name! The boulder lurched forward, sending Lucas flat on his face and the stone rolling on its own. He pushed himself up, cackling, and rushed after it, slamming it with his shoulder and a grunt. Yours is the kingdom! And again, and the power! And again, and the glory! Lucas heaved as the stone crept past the hem of the hungry darkness, and the giant screamed and writhed, dozens of tongues flying in a dozen voices as his flesh split and came back together like wet clay sprinkled with blood. Forever! Amen! He gave one final shove, heart thudding in his chest and body boiling hot as the boulder rolled forward on its ancient wheels and was swallowed by the maw. He panted and stepped back, watching the outline of the stone disappear, barely visible through the backlight of the random explosions dying fast as they came. The giant, Azazel, writhed like a mass of inarticulate flesh that couldn't decide what form to take, but always was bound beneath the chains. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then he shut his eyes and crumpled to his knees, catching himself as the strength seeped out of him like water through cloth, leaving him gasping and cold as his eyes flew open on the burning blackness. The howling filled his ears, rising until it broke apart into screams. 1,000,000 trillion voices all screaming out, in pain or fear or hatred or sorrow or horror. His eyes went wide as the shadows receded for a moment, and the yawning mouth slowly shut. His breath froze in his throat as the mastless hills of shadow on shadow became roiling waves of bodies, scattered over one another and across a vast landscape. Mountains and valleys wove together for billions of miles with human shapes crawling, cursing across its face. Some burned with scarcely seen fire. Others beat back at something crawling up from the barren soil to gnaw at them. Others fought one another, ripping themselves apart or tearing off pieces of their own body in search for relief of their rotting corpses. Then, in an instant, the mouth sealed, and the darkness was just earthly shadow. The cold was just the chill of the dirt. The silence was just from the insulation of the hill. There was still a pit in the wall where the yawning darkness had been, but it was just jagged rock and soil that stretched a few feet deeper and stopped. Lucas sputtered a breath and wrapped his arms around himself as he looked over the cold, bloating body of Mr. Eve Abadi. He swallowed. The work's not quite done yet, is it?